Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes. Thank you so much for tuning into my webcast. Today I'm going to be talking to you about this beautiful book, Childhood Youth Dependency by Tove Ditlevsen, also commonly referred to as the Copenhagen Trilogy. In fact, I'm actually really going to be talking to you about this book, Childhood, the first volume. It's a tricky book to categorise, and in fact, if you're passing a bookshop, I would suggest going in and seeing where they've shelved it. Sometimes you'll find it in fiction, other times in memoir. And the truth is, it's that funny category of autofiction, which kind of straddles the two. It's very much about Tove Ditlevsen's life, and the main character is Tove, and it's her memories. But perhaps the focus is more on an emotional truth rather than getting the facts absolutely right. And so perhaps that's why it might lean a little bit more into a fictional side of things, a fictional side of the truth. So I'm going to begin by reading out the opening. To my mind, this is actually the most poignant opening of any book I've ever read. Not to build it up too much. So here we go. In the morning there was hope. It sat like a fleeting gleam of light in my mother's smooth black hair that I never dared touch. It lay on my tongue with the sugar and the lukewarm oatmeal I was slowly eating, while I looked at my mother's slender, folded hands that lay motionless on the newspaper, on top of the reports of Spanish flu and the Treaty of Versailles. My father had left for work, and my brother was in school. So my mother was alone, even though I was there, and if I was absolutely still and didn't say a word, the remote calm in her inscrutable heart would last until the morning had grown old, and she had to go out to do the shopping in Istergarde like ordinary housewives. So I think you can see straight away that this relationship with her mother is complicated and very much at the heart of the book. In our discussions in Emily's Walking Book Club on the Heath and in our Zoom discussion, we really wrangled with this relationship. At times, the mother really kind of betrays her. At other times, they're quite close. It felt quite messy and perhaps therefore quite real. Certainly this idea of having to make yourself invisible, or wishing yourself invisible to be allowed in someone's kind of private world, feels really powerful. There's also a real lack of physical touch in the book, especially between her and her mother, and that felt particularly pronounced given that they're living in a very tiny flat and she has no space of her own. In fact, she writes really kind of brilliantly about when she starts keeping a poetry book with some of her own poems in. She has no private place to keep it, nowhere that it would be safe. So she ends up actually keeping it in her knickers, held in place with her knicker elastic. And I love this. And I mean, that's actually another thing about the book, that although it is so poignant and sad and moving, there are also these bursts of humour, which kind of catch you unawares. Another detail of that opening is the way the mother's, she's saying I looked at my mother's slender folded hands that lay motionless on the newspaper on top of the reports of Spanish flu and the Treaty of Versailles. And I think throughout the whole trilogy of memoir, there's this focus on looking at the hands, on looking at the person, on looking at the relationship, on top of the wider sort of world events that are going on. And although that context is always there, you're aware of Hitler's rise to power and the rest of it, it's very much the background, and she really puts herself in the foreground. And there's even a moment, I think, where she quite selfishly says, oh, if the Nazis come to power, I'll never get my book published. It's this complete what's the word, sort of self-absorption, sort of focus on herself, focus on her relationship with others, and that's far more important, of course, to her than the bigger picture, as far as political events go. So yes, the relationship with the mother, and of course Tove is a poet, and she writes very much about how in her world of this tiny flat, and there's the kind of outside area by the bins where the kids hang out and chat, and it feels quite rough, and there's quite a lot of talk about losing your virginity, and there's prostitutes around. There's a feeling that there's this slightly sordid mix of people in her life, but actually she has poetry at her heart, and she describes, so just as the relationship with the mother is described in lots of different ways, sometimes quite spiky and painful, other times quite close, poetry is described in myriad ways in the book. Sometimes it's enough for Tove just to be writing it, other times she's desperate to share it with someone. One of the most beautiful descriptions, again, is right near the beginning. Let's find it here. She says, "Inside of me, long, mysterious words began to crawl across my soul like a protective membrane. A song, a poem, something soothing and rhythmic and immensely pensive, but never distressing or sad, as I knew the rest of my day would be distressing and sad. When these light waves of words streamed through me, I knew that my mother couldn't do anything else to me because she had stopped being important to me." It's amazing, this idea of this protective membrane crawling across you. You know, it reminds me in a way of another book we read recently in the Walking Book Club, Lem Sisay's My Name Is Why. That moment when poetry is a protection, is an escape, a way out, a power. And very much there's that feeling in this book as well. And perhaps the last thing I should mention is childhood itself, the title of the book. The way she writes about it is just extraordinary. So unlike you would ever imagine someone writing about childhood. There aren't these kind of straightforward recollections, but these incredible sentences and statements. I mean, there are so many, okay, but I'm just going to read the first sentence of chapter 6. Childhood is long and narrow like a coffin, and you can't get out of it on your own. You know, it's almost like this sort of object. At other times it's described as, I think, bands of iron across her heart. At other times like an illness. Sometimes she talks about the worry of not seeing her way out of it. She imagines everyone else being able to see her childhood and how defective it is, almost like a cloth with holes in. It's absolutely extraordinary. You know, the kind of depth of this imagination. And what's important to remember, of course, is that although this particular volume is about her childhood, it's written from her perspective as an adult. So there's this very adult sensibility, you know, kind of layered on top of her childhood, and the perspective, you know, sometimes the childhood is shown to be really sad, other times it's seen to be happy. I would say if you read this book and you find it sad, you know, just you wait until the third book, which is about her addiction and her dependency on opioids. And you know, I think there is one thing that we all noticed in the book club is that she is a depressive, and the poetry, however protective and beautiful that membrane is, those waves of light, really sadly it's not enough. And Tove Ditlevsen, you know, went on to kill herself. And it feels like the messiness of this book, the fact that there are all these contradictory statements, that each one is so beautiful and luminous and, you know, stands alone, and then it's contradicted by another one equally incredible, but just saying something else. It feels like this messiness is born perhaps of a search to try and find something sort of pure, to try and get to the bottom of whatever it is, you know, whatever it is in her soul, and perhaps she doesn't quite get there, and that is a real tragedy. But having said that, this is an amazing book. Everyone in the book club absolutely loved it, and although we struggled in our discussion really to kind of get a true handle on it, I think that messiness is perhaps, in a way, its greatest kind of virtue. So yeah, I really recommend it. Have you read this book? Let me know your thoughts. I'm longing to hear them.